Tonight our phone lines will be open. We hope you'll participate in our program. The C-SPAN phone numbers on the bottom of the screen, 202-624-1111 for those of you living in the eastern half of the U.S. and 202-624-1115 for those of you in the western part of the United States. Please participate, especially those of you who like to read new books. We're going to start with David Opston. This is what his book looks like. It is Too Good to Be Forgotten. Tell me the story of what you wanted to tell here.
Well, I just wanted to tell about what it was like to be a baby boomer. And, you know, I hadn't really planned to do this book, Susan. I was, actually, I was producing a TV show for NBC and something completely unrelated. And I went to Aspen, Colorado, and I bumped into a man who was the editor of Wiley, wonderful fellow named Miles Thompson. And Miles and I got to be friends, and I started telling him these kind of ridiculous stories about my involvement with My Lai and Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers and Watergate, and he said, "You got to write this." And I said, "No." He said, "No, come on, you have to." And I put a couple of the stories down on paper just to see what they'd be like, and he was very encouraging, and next thing I knew, I had a book.
Why do you think it's important this much later to recount the events of the 60s?
Well, I think it's kind of a seminal period in our nation's development, and particularly in even our species' development, because I posit that it was the most fun time to be alive in the history of humanity. In the 1960s, everyone is expanding the envelope out to see where it will go. And you could eat anything, sleep with anyone, smoke anything, be as outrageous as you wanted, and we really felt that we were going to change the world. And there's this incredibly sharp demarcation that the baby boomers, our generation, had with all generations that had come before. And I think an examination of that period has not really been done well, and our generation hasn't been, that period hasn't been well chronicled in either books or movies. So I thought I'd take a shot at it to try and really capture the fun and excitement we all felt in trying to change America.
You wrote in the introduction that we almost succeeded in stealing America from the grown-ups. And then you continued and said, and then became those very adults we used to make such fun of.
Yes.
If that's the case, what did it all mean?
Well, it was a transitory period, obviously. Is that what I hope is, as grown-ups, some of the lessons that we learned in the 60s will be applied to our lives and henceforth to the society as well. That learning certain things such as women are equal citizens, that people of color have the same rights as white people. You remember when I was a kid, when I was the age of some of your staffers, the institution of segregation was state mandated throughout these United States. I mean, that's within my lifetime. If I was on your show, you know, 30 years ago, it would have been against the law for me to be married to a person of a different race. I mean, that's a pretty staggering thing. And I feel that some of the changes that have taken place because of the, quote, movement and of the energy that we tried to put forth during that time stay with us today and have made us a better people.
Are you political today?
Yeah. I'm more involved right now in education than any other aspect. As I, for the last few years, was on the Los Angeles County Board of Education and tried to bring about using new technologies to reach at-risk children. That really is kind of my issue. But, you know, as I say in the book, and I really firmly believe, is that we got pretty out there. In fact, I'll recount real quickly is, I was in a march in 1971 with a wonderful journalist named I.F. Stone. And Izzy was one of these guys who was a constant gadfly and causing all kinds of trouble. And we're marching to the Congress for these Vietnam vets to throw their medals onto the steps to protest the war. And I'm enormously excited, and I turned to Izzy and saying, "We're winning, Izzy, we're winning. We're going to change the whole country." And he's just this wonderful, wise man, and he says, you guys aren't going to change anything. He says, first off, your generation has the attention span of a baby gnat. And secondly is you don't bring about profound social change without some kind of guide, without a plan. As much as we may detest the communists, they had the manifesto. As much as we may not respect what's happening in China, Mao had the Little Red Book. You kids don't have anything. You don't have an agenda to follow. And what's going to happen is, yes, there will be some profound changes that take place, but there's not going to be anything substantial because you don't have a roadmap. And I remember I almost burst into tears. If I could just 1 sec, as Izzy reached into his pocket and he said, you know, don't feel badly. Let me tell you something I'm putting in my column. It's a quote from Lillian Hellman. Now, just read it for your listeners. And Lillian Hellman says, God knows many of them are fools, and most of them will be sellouts. But they're a better generation than we were. Since when are youths not allowed to be asses?
And that, for you, sums up the 60s?
That sums up an awful lot of it.
If you are a baby boomer and would like to join in the conversation here, or for you, the baby boom generation is old history and you'd like to learn more, please participate in our discussion. Our phone lines are on the bottom of your screen. We'll be going to calls in just a couple of minutes, and this is the book, Too Good to Be Forgotten. David Obst is the author of the book, and he's here with us for about 40 more minutes to talk about his experiences. Well, I do want to get to the one aspect of your book which has created a bit of controversy. The New York Times, Felicity Barringer, wrote a story a few weeks back about what is almost your final chapter. Toward the end, you talk about the Woodward and Bernstein and Deep Throat, a person who has been a mystery in current politics. Your point is what about Deep Throat?
Well, I'll tell you what, I will tell all of your viewers who Deep Throat is if they go to Amazon.com right now and order the book. No. I write in the book, and I firmly believe that Deep Throat was a composite character made up by Carl and Bob. And first, let me just say, I'm not just shooting off my mouth to sell copies of the book, although I don't mind that. But I put it into the book because it was, and again, I don't want your people to think this is a book about Watergate, because it's not. This is really only 5-6 pages in a longer continuum. But I was troubled when I recently went back and read All the President's Men and watched the movie for a number of reasons. The primary one was that the movie ends with Bob Woodward saying to his partner Carl Bernstein, in the movies played by Redford and Hoffman, our lives are in danger, the CIA are after us. And I realized that a whole generation of kids now believes that our government would in fact do something like that. And there's not a scintilla of evidence or truth to this. The CIA was never after Carl and Bob. They were never in danger. I mean, Nixon and his people couldn't even pull off a third-rate burglary, let alone put a hit out on the two top investigative reporters in the world. So it bothered me. So I went back to look at the thing, and there's a lot of evidence to support what I feel is the fact there is no Deep Throat. And by the way, I'm not alone in this thought. As Howard Baker, the senator who was the ranking Republican on the impeachment committee, not the impeachment, the Senate investigative committee looking into Richard Nixon, said on Meet the Press just a couple weeks ago, he doesn't think there's a Deep Throat. Every journalist that I've come in contact with has said, no, there's no Deep Throat. I sold the book, let me just give you a little bit of background. I was running Ramparts I was an editor for Ramparts magazine, who your next guest was actually the editor, David Horowitz. And David and I were trying to make the world safe for whatever it is we believed in those days. And I got a call from Carl Bernstein saying, you think this Watergate stuff might be a book? I said, sure. I'll be in Washington in a couple weeks. Let's talk. I flew to Washington, met with Carl and Bob. We went to Bob's apartment and we wrote up a proposal. It began Martha Mitchell reached across the bed for John. He wasn't there. He was on the phone to the Western White House. There was trouble. We sent this proposal out to, I sent the proposal out to 10 publishers, going to have an auction. Because Carl and Bob wanted a couple of things. A, they wanted the rest of the world to know that this was a valid story, because they were way out in front of the rest of the press. Nobody was following them. And B, they needed some dough. Bob was making like $400 a week. And here was a chance to cash in. So send the book out to 10 publishers, go up to New York, wait to have this auction, and I am for America. Nobody wants to buy it. They all pass. Fortunately, there's one publisher left, Simon & Schuster, who I haven't shown it to. And I had sold, previous to this, I had worked with Daniel Ellsberg, and we had worked on getting the Pentagon Papers disseminated and out, and I had become Dan's literary agent and sold his book to Simon & Schuster. So I had purposely not sent the proposal to Simon & Schuster because I didn't want to put all my literary eggs in one basket. The president of Simon & Schuster was in Washington, coincidentally, and he agreed to meet with Carl and Bob at the Hay Adams Hotel. And I said, all right, I'll be down in the morning, we'll meet. I recount in the book this kind of ridiculous evening I had the night before, which I won't go into in detail, but I end up showing up at this meeting for a variety of reasons, tripping on acid, which had been slipped to me by the former head of High Times magazine. The meeting is a total fiasco. It's the morning that Carl and Bob had broken a story that was wrong. The president, Simon & Schuster, just wasn't interested. They left. He turned to me. He says, pass. Don't want it. And I did something which I'd never done before in a meeting. As I stood up and I began weeping, but just piteously crying. And he grabbed me, and I wasn't sure if he was going to hit me or hug me. And he finally said, all right, if you feel that strongly, I'll do the book. And that's how All the President's Men became a book.
And you felt that strongly that it should be published?
Yeah. Well, I knew that it had to be done. What then happened is Carl and Bob kind of, the story kind of dies. This is in October of 1972. In November, Richard Nixon is overwhelmingly reelected, just smashing George McGovern to smithereens, and one of the big landslides in American history, and everybody is kind of pulling back. Carl and Bob are still trying to keep the story going, but they're not getting anywhere either. And they rough up some material, they turn into Simon & Schuster, and Simon & Schuster's not pleased. And in fact, they're talking about, could we have our money back? And I was just up and I was meeting with the president of Simon & Schuster. He was recounting this to me. So that March, enter Mr. Redford and William Goldman, wonderful screenwriter, who meet with Bob at Jack Valenti's apartment. And right after that, Bob suddenly has a wonderful idea of how to do the book as a personal story, and there's this character, Deep Throat. And what I would argue is that Deep Throat was a device that they needed to make the story work. Deep Throat is the third male lead in this piece. Without him, the story falls apart. It's just a bunch of talking heads. Deep Throat's most famous admonition, let's see if you remember this, Susan, was what?
Have to tell me.
Follow the money.
Which remains a lexicon today. In our lexicon.
Exactly. That line does not appear in the book version of All the President's Men. It only is in the movie. And the screenwriter, when asked about it, Golan says, well, I guess I made it up. Okay. Well, I guess they made up a lot of things. The other things, too, just like the physical evidence,
Can I stop you there? We've got some callers. And in fact, we shouldn't spend so much time on 5 pages in your book. Let's take a call and come out and find out what it's been like for you to have so much attention on this one story, which is really just a small part of what you have to say.
Sure.
Woburn, Massachusetts. Good evening. You are on the air. Woburn, go ahead, please.
Yes. I just have a comment. There are many of us out here that really don't feel that the changes that came about in the 60s or during the 60s was so wonderful. We feel they were more hurtful than helpful to society. And I personally feel that it has promoted an attitude among the last 4 generations of if it feels good, do it. If you want it, take it. And it doesn't matter who you have to hurt to get it.
Thank you.
Well, I think that the excesses of the 60s were obviously catastrophic, in particularly areas of drug usage and sexually transmitted diseases. But I think you can't look at any era as just all plus or minuses. There were some things that were good, there were some things that were bad. I think the altruism that came out of our generations deciding to help each other and to treat people as equals has made us a much stronger and better people. I think that, like all things, it's an admixture of both the good and the bad. But I'm glad that we did it.
We're talking about Too Good to Be Forgotten, Changing America in the 60s and 70s with David Opes. Next call for him is from Portland, Oregon. You're on the air.
Thank you. I wanted to say a couple of things. What does Mr. Opes think was on the 18 minutes of Nixon's tape that was erased, number one, if what we know about was as bad as it was? And number two, I'm just wondering, what if he's not right about that there was, in fact, someone who was really that deep throat? The Carl Woodstein, as I guess they've come to be known, said that they didn't want to reveal who it was until after that person was dead. And I was wondering what Mr. Opes would do if, in fact, he's wrong. What is he willing to put up? Because anybody can say that it's a composite, and they've promised never to disclose it.
Well, as far as the 18 minutes go, I haven't a clue. Is when I've read the tapes, the abuse of power, which was the transcripts of Nixon's White House conversations, and I haven't a clue what was on there. And my guess is probably nothing that would be more devastating than the March smoking gun revelations. As far as what I'm putting up my reputation, and that's all I have. And I talked to Carl and Bob. When I decided to do the book, I called both Woodward and Bernstein to tell them that I was going to make this revelation. And I said to them, look, I'm putting this in the book. And Bob said, you're wrong. There is a deep throat. I said, great. It's 25 years after the fact. Bring him forward. Who's going to go after him? He's certainly not going to get in trouble with Nixon and, his people, because they're long out of power. He says, we can't do it because we've promised to protect the family. But we'll do it right after he dies. And I accepted that, I hung up, and then it suddenly occurred to me, well, wait a second, if you're protecting the family and you put this out right after he dies, you're going to devastate the family. So what's that about? They can't do it because there was no deep throat. What there was a large number of brave men and women who came to Carl and Bob and told them what was going on as far as the break-in and the cover-up was concerned. And I have a great deal of respect for the job that Carl and Bob did. But to believe there's a deep throat makes them nothing better than stenographers writing down what was taking place. And it just doesn't wash. Look, he was a cub reporter, Bob was. He'd been 9 months on the paper. And you're telling me that he's going to go to the Washington Post Corporation and say, look, I'm taking on the most powerful guys in the world. I want you to put this story on the front page, but I'm sorry I can't tell you who my source is. Journalism doesn't work that way.
Chicago's next for David Opes. Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to make a quick comment. Unlike the other caller, 2 callers ago, I think the 60s were very, very productive, and I think the values that we developed in that era are going to be and are being transmitted to our kids. And I think it's high time some articulate person like Mr. Opes really went to bat for the 60s and 70s, because in the recent past there have been too many 60s bashing books that have come out, and people seem to be cashing in on bashing the 60s and 70s. So I'm very anxious to read the book.
Caller, what's an example of one of the key values of the era that have been passed along?
Well, I mean, the ones he mentioned, it was inequality, civil rights, and anti-discrimination movement. It was a peace movement, and anti-materialism. Unfortunately, I think many of the products of the 60s became more materialist than they ever had dreamed they would become. But I'm hoping that they will pass on the notions of charity and benevolence is if they are making a lot of money. But those of us who are a product of that era, who aren't making a lot of money, aren't tearing our hair out because we're not in some upper wealthy class.
Thank you. Appreciate the call. What kind of adults have baby boomers made?
I think pretty good ones. One of the things I would urge is for listeners such as the one who just called in and others, get this book and give it to your kids, because I think that's important for these kids to understand how much fun it was to be a baby boomer, how exciting the period was. I mean, we took over the culture. It was the most amazing thing. Is Time magazine in 1965 names the under 25 generation as their man of the year. We controlled the music, the dress, the sexual mores. It was just unbelievable that a generation suddenly would wrest control of the cultural ethos from the grown-ups. And yes, there were a lot of things that spun out of control. There were a lot of things that became excessive. But what we did was change from the narrow confines of what had been before us, the man in the gray flannel suit, the corporate identity of just having to make money. And we began to realize that you could be brothers and sisters with people who were of different belief systems, different races, different sexual orientations than you. That you could respect a person not because of how much money they had, but because of what their ideas were and because what they believed in. And that you could bring about change, and most importantly is that you could resolve conflict not by just smashing each other, but by cooperating with each other. And I think those were really important issues, and many of us still use that in our lives. One of the things that happened, I will go back to another caller in a sec, but when we were all little kids, Susan, we got inoculated with the polio vaccine. To keep us from dying from polio. We are also inoculated with the American dream. And I think that came to fruition as we became adults, is the fact that we all did get sucked back into the system and began to participate in it because it was so rewarding to do so. And I hope that those thoughts and that those energies that we had when we were in the throes of what I write about in this book do stay with us, because I think they'll make our society a much better, kinder, and noble place to live.
Next call for David Opes is from Northridge, California. Good evening. Northridge, you are on the air. Welcome.
Yes, I have a comment and a question. This subject drives me crazy because I've been in angst for 30 years since Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, having worked for him, and I am familiar with Mr. Opes' works. What really frustrates me most is that I see so much and hear so much criticism of the 60s, and you always see those same demonstration pictures and always the same people with the long hair and all of that. Now, I am very much a liberal from the 60s, 18 years old in 1968. But I spent my time in school, and I spent my time as a philosophy major at UCLA, planning to move on from there. Susan's point is what was learned from the 60s. I think it's to take control of one's own responsibility, and I think that may be the lesson of the 60s. I don't think we'll ever see a time like that again. And my question for Mr. Opes, and I appreciate your patience, is what do you think would have happened had Bobby Kennedy gone on? Now, I know there's talk about whether he would have gotten the nomination or not, but there was a big faction fighting going on between Humphrey's people and McGovern's people and McCarthy's people. If Bobby Kennedy could have brought that together and he was the nominee, do you think he would have become president? And if so, what do you think would have changed? Thank you.
Well, I love playing what ifs, and I think had Bobby lived and not been shot in the Ambassador Ballroom in 1968, is he would have gotten the Democratic nomination and he would have overwhelmingly been elected president, and the most profound change would have been a speedy end to the war in Vietnam and the savings of tens of thousands of American and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lives. I think he would have sped up the fall of communism. I think it would have led to a gentler and kinder nation, but you know, that was a fairly traumatic year for America. Is not only was Robert Kennedy shot, but Martin Luther King was also killed that year. The Tet Offensive took place that year. You know, it really is a bellwether year in American history. The riots in so many of our cities, the demonstrations in Chicago that led to the grown-ups kind of taking back America from the kids and not letting us have any kind of political power. You know, I write in the book about our going to Chicago thinking that maybe because we've taken over the culture, the grown-ups will let us take over the politics also, and it's really where they draw the line. And instead of just grounding us and sending us to our rooms, the grown-ups now say no, and they send us to jail and to hospitals.
In one portion of your book, you find yourself in Taipei.
Yes.
And one of the projects you get involved in is doing audio recordings of missionaries who were in China.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever happened to those tapes?
Well, I have them now, and interesting enough is I'm going to begin next year. I'm teaching at the University of California, Santa Barbara in the Religious Studies program. And what I'd like to do is start to get those tapes transcribed. It was a fascinating period of my life as I decided I wanted to learn Chinese, and this is back in 1966 when nobody in America was having any contact with the Chinese. And I was wandering in the mountains of eastern Taiwan, and I came across this wonderful man who was a Catholic missionary who had been there since literally the turn of the century. And he began telling me his stories, and I said, whoa, are there many more like you around here? And he said, yeah, the island is honeycombed with them. So I went and I got a tape recorder, and I dutifully traveled every weekend out to some enclave where there was a missionary, and I recorded their lives. And I was going to go for my doctorate at Berkeley in using these tapes, but the Vietnam War got in the way. And I still have them, and I may find some use for them now that I'm in the Religious Studies department at UCSB, and I would love to donate them to, you know, or if anybody else is out there and is interested in this area. What I have is about 100 hours of tapes of men who were in China from about 1906 to 1949, and it's their first-hand observations of what life was like. Oftentimes these men were the vehicles for modernization in China, and they certainly were all first-hand observers of the historic changes that were taking place in those times.
How difficult was it for you to travel to that part of the world at that time?
Well, getting into Taiwan was pretty easy. Getting to stay there was harder because I guess the cliche of the best way of learning Chinese affairs is to have one is probably true. As you know, as a young boy, and I was never a very good student, so I was having a lot of trouble learning Chinese until I came up with this clever plan of, remember this is during the Vietnam War, of going into the bars and acting as translators between the soldiers who were coming over on R&R, Rest and Recreation, and the bar girls. And being an 18-year-old virgin and, you know, somewhat terrified of these women, it was very exciting to be in there and talk to them. So what happened was I would spend my evenings working on vocabulary lists, going into the bars, and practicing my Chinese. But the stories I began to hear from these poor kids who were my age coming back from Vietnam on their 2-week respites just really scared me to death. And I began to realize, God, you know, I haven't read any of this stuff in the newspaper. Why aren't other people talking about these things? So eventually, and I write in the book about a very sad and tender incident about having met a Chinese woman, and we kind of ran away together and were trying to hide, and the authorities caught us, and eventually I had to leave and was sent back. But when I came back, I decided, you know, I really want to tell people about some of the stuff I heard about Vietnam. And I started this anti-war news service, which was called Dispatch News Service, which eventuated in my ultimately dropping out of Berkeley and going on to come to Washington to be in the belly of the beast to try and stop this war. And it was interesting because right after I got here, one of the first people I met was this wonderful friend of mine, journalist Cy Hirsch. And Cy had just been given the My Lai massacre story. And he was trying to peddle it to the mainstream press, and nobody would take it. And I was like a little boy saying, Cy, let me have it, can I have it? Finally, just out of desperation, Cy said, okay, it's yours. And of course, I had no idea what I was doing. I was 23. I got a book called The Literary Marketplace. I opened it to the first page, and I called the managing editor, and I continued to call for the next 14 hours, talk to every managing editor in America, peddling this thing. And a lot of them finally said, yeah, we want to send it along, which was great, except this is 1969. How do you send copy yet? There's no such thing as fax. There's no such thing as Federal Express. And I finally have all the way to the W's, and I called the Washington Post. I got a wonderful man named Howard Simons, who was the managing editor there. And I said, and we got to talking, and he was, you know, Howie was just a wonderful guy. I finally said, Mr. Simons, how does one send copy to a newspaper? And he laughed for what I felt was a little too long. And he said, you send it out by telex, which was an old system where you'd go to Western Union and they would put it on a telephone wire and it would come out on an old teletype thing. So I gleefully ran back to tell Cy, all right, Cy, we got 50 papers are going to run it, and I'm sending it out by telex. And Cy like grabbed me and slammed me against the wall, and he said, that's going to cost us thousands of dollars. How are we going to pay for that? And I kind of gasped, telex collect. And that's how we sent out the My Lai story.
Who published it first?
It was published simultaneously in a large number of newspapers. We had like the Chicago Sun-Times, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Boston Globe. Interestingly enough, the Washington Post didn't run our story. They ran a variation of our story, but they put their own correspondent's name on it.
And no credit to Cy Hirsch?
Oh, no credit to Cy Hirsch. And of course, just to finish up on this real quick, I'll tell you a great Cy Hirsch story is the New York Times did not run it. And the My Lai story wasn't just one story, it was a series, began to escalate. And Cy just, I mean, it's I just urge readers, if no other reason, to buy the book, just to read about Cy's heroic story of how he kept this thing going. Anyway, he finds Lieutenant Calley, the man who was the culprit in this, and we then find also this other guy who will admit that he shot the babies and women and children in the ditches. It's the front page story of the World. And we decide we're going to put it on the CBS Evening News. Mike Wallace is going to be the correspondent. And this is big time stuff. They fly us on in here. We're in a hotel room, and Abe Rosenthal, who was then the executive editor, I guess, of the New York Times, calls up. He says, great story, kid. He says, but the New York Times is a paper of record, and we really would like to have our own correspondent do this. Cy grabs the phone out of my hand. He says, Mr. Rosenthal, Paul Meadlow is the name of the guy who shot the kids. And he says, Paul Meadlow, somewhere in New York. You're the paper of record. Find him. Hangs up on him. Second goes by. The phone rings again. Cy picks it up. Abe Rosenthal says, do you know who I am? Cy says, yep. Hangs up on him again. It's a terrific story, particularly since 2 months later, Cy was hired by Abe Rosenthal to become the top investigative reporter of the New York Times.
David Opes will be with us for about 5-6 more minutes. Oak Brook, Illinois next. Good evening.
Hello, Mr. Opes. Incidentally, Susan, I'm self-appointed president of the Susan Swain fan club.
Well, aren't you nice? Thanks for calling in this evening. What do you want to talk to our
Mr.
guest
Opes,
about?
My question, and it's just one question, concerns deep throat. Those of us that lived through that period were wondering if the reason that deep throat was never identified could have had anything to do with Mrs. Mitchell, and no one wanted any responsibility for her demise.
I don't really see any correlation. Poor Martha Mitchell was really a tormented soul. She felt her husband, and probably rightfully so, as being set up as the fall guy for so much of what was happening with Watergate, and she caused all kinds of trouble to the Nixon administration because she just wouldn't stay quiet. And in particular, she would keep calling the Associated Press and Helen Thomas and just giving her all kinds of great stories. And every time all these spin masters would think they had everything under control, Martha would blow it out of the water. But I think we can safely say Martha Mitchell was not deep throat.
When we were talking before the program began, you suggested that you might even have an op-ed piece in you about the whole deep throat portion of this book. What is it you want to say?
Well, I just think it's interesting that I've raised this issue, and it's not just myself. I think I've made a pretty strong case, or at least raised some serious issues as to whether or not there is a deep throat. And I think that for whatever reasons, the Washington Post has decided to just ignore this story. The Associated Press picked it up and it went out to every newspaper in the country. The New York Times has talked about it. A lot of other responsible media people have picked this up, and the Washington Post remains strangely silent. So I think I might write a piece called The Silence of the Post as to why, this paper that has been in the lead of exposing so many different things in other areas won't at least take a look at themselves.
This is the book. Once again, it's called Too Good to Be Forgotten. David Opst is the author. Now he is a writer and producer in Hollywood, lives in Santa Barbara. But he tells the story in this book of changing America in the 60s and 70s from his very special perspective as someone who really was involved in many of the major stories of the time. Thank you for being here with us tonight.
It was fun.